reading glasses, wires. What, you still have a co-sponsor?
Wants to co-sponsor, but he's not here.
I just wondered whether he took his name off of the list. Okay, let's, ready? I'd like to call the Rules and City Government Committee to order. For the record, note that Alderman Savage and Alderman Arnett, members of the committee, are present, and Alderman Schandelmeyer is here also, as well as staff. I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as written.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Next is approval of the minutes from the September 7th meeting.
I'll move approval of the minutes, but note in passing that one of the things that the minutes recorded was that we requested the Office of Law to provide us information on rent control, which was a topic of the last meeting. I don't see that we've received that, but I move approval of the minutes.
Okay.
Second?
Second. All in favor of approving the minutes as written, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. I think City Assistant Attorney Leonard is online. She's on screen, so may we ask Ms. Leonard if we have been sent any information on rent control? That was a question given to Mr. Lyles, if I remember correctly, by me, actually.
He did not hold that long to pass along.
You're kind of frozen. Well, that's not a question pertinent at this moment, but we can come back to it when you're not frozen, when you've thawed out.
Madam Chair.
Alderman Savage?
Just want to make a suggestion for Ms. Leonard. It might be easier for her to call in if she's having a bad connection. If that's, I don't know if that's an option, Ms. Green.
I'm not sure when it comes to Skype, but I'll contact Julian.
Can you inquire if she can call in? He said no. Well, I was going to say she could call in one of our phones, and we could put it on speaker. Ask him if we could do it that way. Is he listening? Hi, Julian. I mean, I've done that quite effectively, dealing with my father and doing business over the phone, and he puts me on speaker on one phone, and well, we know that works. So, Ms. Leonard, you can stay on Skype, but if we're not able to hear you when we have questions, we may have you call my cell phone, and then we can put you on speaker so everybody can hear you, and do it that way if Skype isn't working for us.
Alderwoman, this is Julian. Yeah, it's a possibility. You just might want to set up a mic to point right at the phone so that the public can actually hear a response as well.
Where would we have to set up? I'll tell you, you startle me when this voice comes down from.
It's why I try not to do it too often.
Okay, so we can use the other mic that's here.
Yes.
Okay. So that's what we'll do then.
I'll try and call Ashley now.
Say that
Let her know.
again?
I'll try and call Ashley now to let her know.
Okay, thank you. Are you also looking at us in addition to hearing us?
Of course,
Just wanted to know whether you knew I was shaking my head or not.
I do.
Thank you. Okay, going on to legislation before the committee. 0921, accessory dwelling units. For the purpose of establishing accessory dwelling units as an accessory use in certain zoning districts that allow single-family dwellings, establishing the use and bulk requirements for accessory dwelling units and establishing the procedural requirements for accessory dwelling units. So, we have 10 amendments, it appears. So we should probably begin with the Planning Commission's recommendations. Dr. Nash, could you speak to the requirements by way of the Planning Commission?
I can. They made some recommendations which have been put into amendment form, although I'm not sure what number, but I can check on that. 2 and 3. 2 and 3. So since that is the case, would you rather go to the amendments themselves?
Which amendments would be the Planning Commission's amendments?
2 and 3.
2 and 3? Okay, so, well then why don't we go to Alderman Schnellmeyer? And you can begin with your first amendment, since that comes before 2 and 3.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The bill as Amendment 1 addresses a small hiccup in the bill as written. The bill as written caps an accessory dwelling unit to 850 square feet. That was intended to be only for new construction, and Amendment 1 lifts that cap if it is set up in a structure that already exists, such as a garage, attic, or basement. That way, if you have, let's say, a basement that's 1,000 square feet, you would not need to put up a wall in your basement that already exists as a structure and footprint in order to shrink it, adding to the cost overall of the project.
Okay.
Amendment number 2 was a
Do you
planning...
want us to take these individually, or I prefer to take 1 separately and then 2 and 3 is the Planning Commission's recommendations.
Sure.
So, colleagues, Amendment 1, Alderman Arnett?
And I think that's also addressed in a later amendment. If you recall, back when we were doing 03919 or 20, the Rodriguez Amendment, these units were 600 square feet. This makes them 850, and now, if you accept this Amendment 1, who knows how big they can be. My concern, and the concern that I've heard from constituents, is even at 600 feet, you could accommodate quite a few people. And I think one of the things that the Citizens Coalition commented on and submitted to us and to the Planning Commission was worry about overpopulating these dwelling units. Actually, if you look at the HUD report, that's a concern that was expressed by a lot of the communities that they have in the appendix about limiting the number of people could actually be in these accessory dwelling units. If the floor print the footprint on my house is over 1,000 square feet, and that could accommodate quite a few bedrooms and therefore quite a few people. And I have some concerns about that size. You can always, if you're finishing off a basement, in fact, I had a basement like this on Capitol Hill, where the front part of my basement was an English basement and the back part was a common area where all the laundry was and all the other utilities were. So I'm not sure that there's some hardship in a basement unit having it segmented to the accessory dwelling unit and then non-accessory dwelling unit.
I have a question for Dr. Nash. Is there a standard which determines capacity based on bedroom availability?
In Title 17 in the building code, there are requirements for square footage per person. And, but it's pretty generous. I mean, it would take a lot of people beyond what we would consider to be, you know, a comfortable amount of space to be a violation of that. But typically, it does limit bedrooms in terms of how many beds you can have. And if you have a small space, you usually can't get more than two beds in a space. So it's practically speaking, if you imagine just people crammed into the space, you can get a lot of people there. But in terms of day-to-day living, you know, you're not really ever going to have a situation where people are like that, because you need a kitchen and a bathroom and a hallway and you know, you need all the things that in the end, just that many people can't really fit.
So would not our inspectors determine capacity as they're doing their inspections?
If the ADU owner is going to be getting a rental license.
Okay.
But you can have an ADU and not necessarily rent it out.
Right.
So in that case, we wouldn't know if you had, you know, your extended family living there, you wouldn't need a rental license. We could still get a complaint for overcrowding. But in that situation, there's not much we can do because we don't have access to the interior of the space.
Thank you. Alderman Savage?
Yeah, just say I'm fine with this amendment because I think, you know, again, what it basically does is just says that units that are separated, structures that are separated from the primary structure will have to comply with this 850 square foot limit. But I can see, and it would essentially lift that for those that are part of the primary structure within the existing footprint. I can understand that because some of our structures are quite large in the city, and if somebody wanted to parcel off a part of the existing structure as an ADU, might be tough to fit within that 850 square foot size for some of these homes. I mean, that's why, and I think as we go through some of the amendments, it helps this make more sense, because I think there is a proposal from, I'm not sure if it's Alderman Arnett or somebody else has the proposed definition for accessory unit. And I know that's one thing that we talked about with Dr. Nash at the Economic Matters, was about the definition.
Okay. Alderman Chandler, did I see your hand?
That in the situation my colleague from Ward 8 described with 1,000 square foot footprint, realistically, the most people that would be in there comfortably is a family of 3 or 4 tops. We can come up with ideas of, we could theoretically fit 8 people in this space if we lay it out here, here, and here, and here. But let's be honest, these are people renting these things, and they're going to stay in a situation they feel comfortable with.
I guess I would beg to differ. If you go around the city and look at some of the areas, and in fact, Alderwoman Bindle Charles is really concerned about this. There are a lot of people jammed into some buildings. Think of Tyler Avenue. And the way you can tell how many people are jammed in there is to see how many vehicles are parked outside the buildings. I think that you can overpopulate these spaces quite easily. Now, where I would agree with you is if these are owner-occupied, I would think the primary resident would not want to be jamming themselves up, and there are several amendments here that speak to primary residence. But if those fail, I think that this could open the door for some significant overpopulating of spaces. And particularly if the next amendment carries where there's no parking requirement. Again, you can look at situations around the city where this is already occurring and see some significant crowding situations.
Okay, thank you. Alderman Savage?
Are you ready for a motion?
If you are.
I would like to move a favorable recommendation for Amendment 1.
Oh, I'll second that. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of favorable recommendation for Amendment 1, please say aye.
Aye.
No.
Opposed? Okay, one opposition. Okay, Amendment 2, Alderman Schneidermeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This was on the recommendation of the Planning Commission, and it is one that I very strongly find myself in agreement with. Off-street parking requirements, when I put this in, I was unaware of the severe degree in which it impacts the ability for these things to get built. From one, a financial cost for the homeowner. These are built by individual homeowners, not developers with large pockets who are able to absorb these here and there. And also in the name of space accommodation for individual lots where they may not be able to have the accommodation on their lot to build the accessory structure and an additional off-street parking space. Then you have the consideration that by requiring off-street parking, we are subsidizing driving, which we all say here and there, sometimes in meetings, sometimes just when we're all talking, that we need to encourage things to make us a more walkable city, less car-dependent city. And this is a very good start on one. Under best case scenario, these things get built to 1 or 2% of lots, and states and jurisdictions that have allowed accessory dwelling units have only seen an increase of 1 to 2 cars per accessory dwelling unit built. Then there's the cost issue for the individual renters, where this can add somewhere between 5 to 15% of hard cost for the building, and therefore 5 to 15% in the actual monthly rental cost of the unit itself. This is based on 1, a study from the Brookings Institute, and 2, a study from the High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. And then finally, there is the fundamental moral argument of storing your car is not as important as housing for people. And by putting an off-street parking requirement in, we are saying we believe that car storage is more important than housing.
Thank you. Committee members, is there interest in a motion to support Amendment Number 2 or oppose Amendment Number 2?
I would start with
Arnett?
discussion, and again, when you look at the HUD report and you look at the various communities that have adopted it, quite a few of them do have additional parking requirements in our basic code for single-family zones, and this is what this speaks to. Primarily, we are requiring an off-street parking, particularly any new construction. So I don't understand why, if you're putting 2 units on there, you wouldn't require the additional parking space. I heard this saw about we're housing people, not cars, but let's be honest. Additional people come with additional cars, and 2 or 3 cars makes a big difference in neighborhoods, particularly if this becomes a successful mode of housing people through accessory dwelling units. So I think we have to be mindful of the people who are already living there and in many cases already feeling the pinch from parking. I'm thinking of parts of Eastport that there is no off-street parking at all. And now we're going to put even more cars competing, thinking like Eastern Avenue, places like that, who are already also suffering the spillover parking from things like the Maritime Museum. And now we put in additional people with no limit. and no additional parking requirement. I think this flies in the face of our our adequate public facilities code for parking, and we really have to be mindful of the people who are living here now and what they have to put up with, as well as the new people we'd like to bring in for these accessory dwelling units. So I would offer a motion to oppose amendment number 2.
Is there a second? I'll second that. Alderman Shelmar? I'm sorry, Alderman, I have to defer to the committee member first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, and I'm definitely sympathetic to the parking concern, but I think it's important statistic that Alderman Schandelmeyer brought up, in that this isn't, if we look at all the jurisdictions, this has not led to a huge increase in units, only 1 to 2% of the housing stock. So that it's not a lot of additional parking impact, and I think this could be addressed other ways, especially, I mean, I think your concerns are more valid and hopefully some of these will be long-term rentals, but even that, but again, with the short-term rental, I just stayed at one in another jurisdiction, and they provided a parking pass. Maybe that's something that another way to be handled, because I think the only areas in town where parking is going to be an issue are wards 1 and 8, parts of it. And I'm not saying that to be dismissive, but just to, I think that's really, for the most part, maybe wards 2 a little bit as well. But and some of them, I think this parking issue could be resolved through the existing parking passes that we have. Eastport, I know, doesn't have it, so that's more difficult to deal with. But it would be nice, I do think for some of these situations, people, especially for short-term rentals, they should be able to be directed to parking garages or provided perhaps a limited number of parking passes. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I am with this. I'm torn on it, but I am inclined to support it in light of some of the statistics that were presented.
Alderman Schandelmeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to point out that, or respond to one of my colleagues' comments. Not everyone wants to have multiple cars. And we don't talk about, oh, what will this do for the parking when a family of 6 moves into the single family home next door, but we're doing this about a dwelling unit that may at most, again, according to other jurisdictions and data, bring 1 to 2 cars per neighborhood. I'm also going to push back on we're in a limited amount of parking. We have a limited amount of parking directly in front of our final destination, but unless we turn the entire city into a parking lot, we cannot accommodate for that. And it is okay for us to start saying, maybe we don't need to put down more environmentally damaging asphalt and impervious surface for storing a thing that dumps out tons of carbon dioxide every time we go somewhere, and encourage that at the expense of housing. Maybe it's okay if we try and go, we're not going to accommodate your car, try to find another way to get around. And walking 200 feet to your final destination isn't a sky is falling situation. Now, I do know that that may sound contentious to some people, but truth be told, we can either choose to keep accommodating cars and paving more areas of the city for an environmentally damaging thing, or we can start going, okay, for this one thing that's only shown to bring in 1 or 2 cars per unit on a unit that gets built under best case scenarios of 1 to 2% of lots, maybe we can stop doing cars as the #1 priority.
Thank you. Alderman Arnett?
So one of the problems with this legislation is that it is omnibus across the city. So in Alderman Savage's ward, which is much more of a suburban community, I think this is not a particular problem. There probably is, it's quite easy to accommodate the parking without an additional requirement. But there are older, denser parts of the city where parking is already a problem. It's a big problem. We're already having very serious talks in Ward 8 about going to permit parking. Permit parking, I think, is a thing that is going to have to come. Unlike Ward 1, we don't have parking garages and give people vouchers. And so I think it's easy to be cavalier about the circumstances that some people have to live in their neighborhood, but I think that we need to be accommodating of all of the different situations. Now, if we could do legislation that is ward-specific or area-specific, maybe we could be a lot more flexible here. But this is a very fall on the sword issue for me in Ward 8 representing my constituents.
Alderman Savage, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Nash to weigh in as far as the Planning Commission's thinking behind this.
Yeah, so, and I respect that. And, that's one thing I did throw out at Economic Matters is I think there might be a way to address that by having this go through, I'm trying to recall if this goes through special exception process as written, but you could simply change it so that it needs a special exception when these are proposed in zoning in your ward in the conservation districts. And then one of the factors to be considered could be parking as a part of that process. That might be one way to make sure that particular community's voice is heard.
May I ask, how would that work? Each ward would have a different...
Well, let me look at this legislation again. So it's, I guess I'm looking at page 4 and the use tables. And let's see, the districts that are in Ward, which one are the ones in Ward 8?
Yeah, it's at the bottom of page 4.
Yeah, the bottom of page 4.
Where several of the zones are subject to standard, which means special exception. The problem is there's no special exception criteria.
Yeah, so I guess that would have to be added to the legislation, but I just thought that might be one way forward. I'd be happy to support something like that too.
Okay.
The special exception issue is this bill follows any kind of process and regulations for any kind of special accessory structure. So if there's a special exception for building any accessory structure such as a garage, that same exception would apply to accessory dwelling units. So the rules are the exact same for special exceptions, setbacks, etc.
Dr. Nash?
Actually, the rules are the same for anything any property that is applying for a special exception. They have to meet the special exception criteria. And we require special exception for uses where the use in that particular location could be more impactful than that use in another location in the same zoning district. So it's basically an extra look at the use in a specific context to evaluate its impact. And there are set criteria for special exceptions, which are general, but are supposed to give the Board of Appeals the tools to evaluate the impact of the intensity of that use in a given context. So I think what Alderman Arnett was saying, there aren't specific exception criteria related to accessory dwellings, which is the case. But any accessory dwelling unit that wanted to go forward in R2NC or in C1 or C1A would need a special exception. All the accessory dwelling units have to meet the standards that are given in the code in this ordinance. But those 3 zoning districts, they would have to go through this additional process of going to the Board of Appeals.
So that is already included in the legislation.
That's right.
Okay. The Planning Commission's discussion, did they take into consideration other options for the parking period? I mean, they went from needing parking to not needing parking, period. There's no, did they talk about special exception? Did they talk about, or did they make any other considerations?
I don't remember, and perhaps Alderman Schandelmeyer does, but I know, though, that the Planning Commission is typically interested in looking at ways we can reduce parking requirements and creating space that's just dedicated to automobiles. So it wouldn't surprise me that they made such a recommendation.
I also was.
Got them on that recommendation because going into the Planning Commission, I had already made it my intention of putting forward what became Amendment Number 2 to remove the off-street parking requirement after reading further literature and urban planning manuals for how parking requirements can stymie the construction of these. So I was very open and upfront with them about my goals, and through pretty much the similar arguments I've made here, their increase in cost, their increase in environmental impact, and how we as a city need to start accommodating more for people and less for automobiles. And it convinced them.
Alderman Savage, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry, Alderwoman Tierney, welcome. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. For Dr. Nash, when she's free. But I can start by saying, contrary to what Alderman Arnett said, the parking requirement lifted in Ward 1 is a challenge. The garage, you know what's happening in the next 3 years. But I want to ask a question. Is the special exception process in C1 and C1A, will the parking requirement be brought up? Is that a standard? It's an ignorant question on my part. I don't know the standards for the ADUs, but at that time, could the public say this has an impact on the parking?
There is a standard in the special exceptions. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's about traffic circulation, and there's a safety component as well. I would think if you could make an argument along those lines, you could bring that up as part of your argument against a special exception in a particular location.
Yeah, I do totally get the Planning Commission's path forward on minimizing cars, but there are different densities that we're aware of, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
There could also be, this is unsolicited advice, that you could also make different parking requirements in different zoning districts. We do that for other uses. Just a thought.
Well, and that's why I asked if the Planning Commission had considered any other options between the two, but clearly they did not. Okay.
I just don't remember. It was like, more than a week ago.
I don't know why you don't remember everything that goes on at every one of these gazillion meetings that you have to go to. Committee members, what's your pleasure? There is a motion on the floor that we oppose amendment number 2. And I will speak to it. I have not. This is one of the amendments that gives me heartburn. And maybe because I grew up in Eastport and my church is still there and my family is still there. And I think I don't want to say irresponsible because that's kind of harsh, but I find it difficult to add additional housing no matter what the need and not provide parking. That's just a concern for me. And I know, Alderman, that you have this vision that we will be a city with few vehicles and very healthy and capable residents who can walk, or that we will have a transit system that will accommodate our needs, but we're not there yet. And so I find it difficult to put a standard in place when we can't meet the need that's going to be required by that standard. So to eliminate or to create a housing option and not give difference to parking is a tough one for me. So,
What, if I could respond to that
Alderman-
very briefly?
yes.
We aren't there because we keep going, building for cars is just as important as other things. This is not something that takes away cars, but it goes something that we all admit in conversations, again, in various hearings and on the council and just amongst each other, that we need to start being less car dependent. And that means at some point we're going to have to take those steps that makes it more people-centric and less car-centric. I think this is something that will have, based upon the data in other jurisdictions, such a minimal amount of impact, because again, 1 to 2% of lots build these, and it adds maybe 1 to 2 cars extra based on other jurisdictions that have implemented this, even without the parking requirements, that this would be a good first step for us to take. There we go.
Thank you. And it's unfortunate, and I guess we'll have this discussion again on Monday night when the full council is here. But I'm sure there are others who will disagree about there being such a minimal impact as in other jurisdictions. So anyway, what is your pleasure? Are we ready to call the question? Okay, all in favor of giving opposing amendment number 2, please say aye.
Unfavorable recommendation.
I'm sorry,
Unfavorable.
unfavorable. Okay, I'm sorry.
Aye.
Correct terminology. An unfavorable recommendation to amendment number 2.
Aye.
Please say aye.
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 No.
Okay, amendment number 3, Alderman Schnellmeyer.
This
Again,
was-
the Planning Commission's recommendation, correct?
Yeah, so this was another recommendation from the Planning Commission that I think is a lot more controversial with some folks, and I am understanding of why. This would ban the short-term rental, this would lift the short-term rental ban on accessory structures. This is something that, when the Planning Commission recommended, I was a little unsure about, but me being me, I dove myself into further research in other jurisdictions. And this is something that is actually good overall for the construction of these, because it increases the financing, it increases the flexibility of homeowners and increases the likelihood of banks allowing their financing. Now, I will also say, and I point to my own situation, for how we define short-term rentals in our city would have included how I first came to our city, which I'm increasingly learning was just super illegal. But hey, now you got me to deal with. So we define a short-term rental as anything less than 90 days, which would exclude month-to-month renters, which is a pretty significant demographic, I feel like, of people just starting out, not knowing where their roots can be. And I think we do ourselves a disservice by excluding them, because if we can keep folks like that here in Annapolis, help them get down the roots, help them get on a steady stage, they can become valued members of our community. And there's also the flexibility and financing issue. And in the discussions about housing affordability, another part of that is helping people live in the homes that they have purchased, because we all know that purchasing homes in our city is exorbitantly expensive. And by giving that flexibility, we can allow people to stay in place. That said, even my own co-sponsor disagrees with me, as do some other people who have expressed support overall for this bill and even other amendments that I care about in this bill. But that is why I think Amendment 3 is a benefit to the legislation.
Thank you. Alderman Arnett, or?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm in favor of this one. You know, I have had concerns about short-term rentals in the past, and I still do when they're in high density. But in this case, since they're going to be tied to a primary structure, I have less of a concern because presumably the primary structure it won't be able to be a short-term rental. It's going to have to be either a long-term or actually, depending on what amendments are passed, it's going to have to be the owner of the property, owner-occupied. And I also think the 90-day point is a good one, because we do have a number of seasonal folks who live here. So And it also, I think, you've mentioned before, it helps to make properties more affordable for people to buy potentially if they do have this, and also just for future family planning if they have, I mean, well, I guess this wouldn't really be the family planning part because it's going to be short term, but in any case, I think I am in support of this amendment.
Alderman Arnett?
So one of the express purposes, and you can find it on page 1 of the ordinance, is to provide more affordable housing. And part of the theory as espoused by the sponsors is if we make more housing affordable, we'll drive down the price of housing and make it more available to more people. We actually have someone in the audience that provided me with some materials which I think is good reading and commend it to people about the amount of affordable housing that accessory dwelling units really is likely to produce, and it is small, and therefore conceding to the sponsor, likely small impact. But if you're going to do short-term rentals, I think you preclude, that is going to be the highest return on investment. And you're going to preclude the availability of long-term affordable housing in a secondary unit in these accessory dwelling units. So I just think that it's antithetical to the stated purposes and goals and objectives of the sponsor. In terms of financing and things like that, I think there's some misinformation here. You cannot, if you're trying to buy a house that has an accessory dwelling unit, the lenders will not consider that potential rental income in granting you your mortgage. Well, we can have a debate about that. I'm sorry, I'm speaking, and I have it from lenders that you cannot count that to qualify for your loan. All right, I'm sorry, I was speaking. Again, if we're going to try to provide affordable housing, as Alderman Chandlemeyer said he found when he came to the city, that's not short-term rental space. That's longer-term accommodations. And to me, putting in short-term rentals is not going to provide the very goal of the sponsors of entry-level affordable housing. So I strongly oppose this. Although I will also say a lot of these votes on my part are really going to be strongly tempered when we get to the whole discussion about whether these are going to be owner-occupied primary residence or whether these are going to be investment two-family housing units. And I think there are some real differences in the code that I'd like to get into when we get to that point. But I think that short-term rental is the highest rate of return and therefore is the most likely kind of thing that people will do to defray their costs of home ownership. And I think that does not fly in the face of providing more affordable housing. That flies in the face of providing more affordable housing.
Thank you. Alderman Chandlemeyer?
So I technically got my start here on what our city would have defined as a short-term rental, a 30-day to 30-day lease. It was very affordable for me. It allowed me to establish roots, get down past when I was, for my only source of income, making a paid internship, making less than $25,000 a year. And it allowed me to get to a point where I could actually go out, not on my own, not rent entirely on my own. I was able to rent some with roommates, but it gave me that ability to put roots down. That's what increasing the flexibility of this can do. And you also look at the financing from banks provided, allowing short-term rentals, and this is information I got from the ARP Maryland. By allowing that, banks are more likely to provide financing for this because they see it as a greater chance for them to get their funding back. And let's say owner A, who builds it, does do short-term rentals, but then they sell it out, go somewhere else. Owner B goes, okay, well, I'm more comfortable doing a longer-term rental than owner A was, and so I'm going to long-term rent, providing this longer source of housing ability. We need to see housing as a complex system and not a complicated system where different actions that we take have different reactions and impacts. And by allowing that, we need to allow as much flexibility as possible in this. So by allowing this, we have more flexibility and I think more ability to let these be built, and in a longer term impact, can provide more housing for the long term. That said, in this case, I will respect disagreement and not roll my eyes. So,
Thank you. So is there a motion on Amendment 3? Alderman Savage.
Well, I would like to move for a favorable recommendation. I mean, I do think, may I just discuss that a little bit, or we'll see if there's a
Please
second? Just in the sense, I do think Alderman Arnett has a lot of good points in terms of, I think the question on whether or not ADUs are going to truly be affordable is a good one, because I'm not quite sure myself, given some of the data that we've seen, that the average cost of an ADU and the average, which I think was like around $130,000 or so, and then the average monthly rent is, I think it was around $1,100. This came from the presentation from Action Annapolis. They had the panel about this, and that's why I'm sympathetic to that argument. That's why I would have liked to have more of a conversation about some kind of rent control or other measure to, I think at one point, was this the last time this legislation came up, we talked about having something tied to the market rate. So I would definitely be sympathetic to that. I mean, that said, that's not enough for me to vote against this amendment, but I do think there's some sound reasoning there.
Thank you, Alderman. Ms. Leonard, can you weigh in at all on the question about rental controls? Or should we call you by phone?
Here we go.
Can you hear her?
I'm going to put you on speaker.
Oh, she's on your phone? Okay.
Hello?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
The question came up about research on rent controls.
Hold on. Okay. The city attorney didn't pass along your request to me when he assigned me this, but for my general background on rent control is doable, but you have to have higher than a reasonable standard. And especially if you're going to limit it to only certain types of property versus, long-term, month-to-month, and short-term. Because then you're essentially discriminating between the different type of rental options.
So
But I'd have to research it more because the city attorney didn't mention that you guys had wanted this.
So just on what you just commented, it sounds like it would be discouraged for fear that it would implement some form of discrimination.
Yeah, because you can do it. Most rent controls that happen in other bigger cities are established universally across all type of rentals, and they have very sound reasons. Not that you guys can come up with those reasons, but each time you try to narrow the categories for what the restriction applies to, it raises the bar for what your reasons have to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Dr. Nash? Thank you, Ms. Leonard. Dr. Nash, could you weigh in as far as the Planning Commission's thinking behind this amendment? Especially in light of the fact that we just did STY legislation Was that 6 months ago?
The STR?
Last year? Seems like yesterday.
That's right. I believe they were swayed by the idea that it could create more opportunities for people who needed a little bit of income to get by, but didn't want to be involved in a long-term rental situation.
I think what sticks in my mind is the potential income, considerable income that we learned about when we were doing the other legislation. It's not a little bit of money, and seems to be an opportunity to open the door for more of a business than a residential. So Alderman Arnett and then Alderman Savage.
So while we're discussing short-term rentals, I think that part of the problem with both the STR and this is going to be enforcement. I think that Alderwoman Tierney's Amendment 7 starts to speak to this, but in terms of short-term rentals, do we really have a good fix on how many are operating? We know how many are licensed. Do we know how many people are doing month to month versus week to week? Do we know how many people are really doing it versus how many people that are getting licensed?
Most of the people who do short-term rentals do it for 1 to 7 days. That's
what I thought.
It's either that or when you look at the bar graph, the next biggest bar is the more than 30 days. So there are some people doing it for the longer periods, but those are the most prominent. And I mean, we are every day getting more people licensed. The number has of active short-term rental advertisements has somewhat plateaued in between the 300 and 400 range, and it's been that way for a few weeks, and it's very seasonal, though, as you know.
So right now we have 353. I think that's the number of licensed short-term rentals.
That is the number of compliant short-term rentals.
Right. Good terminology. We have a lot of short-term rentals that are really legal if they're only doing it during boat show or commissioning week. So that could be a lot of the other activity. But I think one of the things that is going to be coming up is the enforcement. How do we get people? And I think Alderman Chandelmeyer has an Amendment 11, and I'm having a little bit of problems understanding, but also speaking to that. But certainly Alderman Tierney is talking about a moratorium period to allow people who have these units to register them, get inspected, and get licensed. And it's only with the passage of this legislation that we'll really find out, and maybe not then, because we have so many people that are doing things that are non-compliant. And we have some other circumstances in the community, which I'll talk about later, about more than one unit, accessory unit in buildings, and I've found 125 of those in my ward, and how we're going to manage those as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of growing pains when we go to implement this legislation in whatever form it gets passed in. And I'm pretty confident we're going to pass something.
Well, one of my concerns has been capacity on staff. Dr. Nash, and I had thought about an amendment that would connect staff to, the job. I'm always complaining for you guys about putting things on already full plates. Oftentimes we pass legislation that we know we don't have the capacity to monitor. I'd rather we not do that. And so what is your capacity? What would it take for you to be able to accomplish? So
we now, I think that what will mitigate the impact of this legislation is that, first of all, I don't anticipate a rush of people all at once applying for accessory dwelling units. I'm hoping that the people who currently have accessory dwelling units that are not compliant with our current code, as you cannot have accessory dwelling units, would be willing to come in and be licensed. And actually, I've spoken to Alderwoman Tierney about this. I think she has an amendment about incentivizing people coming in and not penalizing them. And I think that will be beneficial, and that will take pressure off our code enforcement and rental enforcement staff, because they won't have to go try and figure out if someone's garage is being used illegally for an accessory dwelling, which is pretty hard to figure out from the outside of a structure. But we get these calls, fairly often, and we have to investigate, and we have to write letters, and we have to check with the owner of the property, and all that takes time. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking not having to do that work effort will help offset the new work effort of licensing the accessory dwelling units, keeping track of them, and when necessary, taking them to the Board of Appeals for special exception approval.
So let me understand what you're saying. Adding the component that would allow short-term rentals would add an additional burden to the inspectors.
For this amendment specifically, I don't know. It depends on if we were going to get a lot of complaints about whether they're really using it as short-term rental and they don't have that kind of license. That would create more work. But if they have legally asked for an accessory dwelling unit license and they have legally asked for a short-term rental license for that accessory dwelling unit, that wouldn't be any more effort than if they asked for a long-term rental license for that unit. It's the same inspection.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And not the same renewal process, but a similar renewal process, same work effort. So it's not so much the short-term rental use per se, unless there are additional enforcement issues, which I could see could arise.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that is not the additional load on staff is not as much an issue.
Right. It would.
Yeah.
Right. It would be easier if they're owner occupied. That is usually easier to figure out and enforce. But I don't think it doesn't matter so much to us if it's a short-term rental or a long-term rental in the accessory dwelling unit as far as staff time, other than possible enforcement issues.
Okay. All right.
So
Alderman Arnett,
my
Alderman
summary
Savage.
comment is that this is a big change for a huge part of the city's housing population. And I think I would want to err on the side of caution. I will not vote to recommend Amendment 3. That doesn't mean that we can't come back at some point and understand that, first of all, we hear that this may have a 1 or 2% impact on the housing stock. We hear there's only going to be 1 or 2 additional cars. We don't know any of that at this point. And I would argue that I am in favor of some version of accessory dwelling units. I definitely would vote right now to pass the bill as submitted. But I think I would argue in the form of caution, and that's why I can't support the motion to support amendment number 3. I will be voting against that.
Alderman Savage?
Just a quick comment about the rent control topic, to go back to that for a second. I do think it's a worthy thing to consider. I know I was another town I was in this summer, Asbury Park, New Jersey, and they actually have a rent control program, and they mentioned nearby municipalities of Neptune Township and Red Bank Bureau apparently have long had it, and it's been upheld as constitutional. But in any case, my point is, I think we could always do this down the road at some point and tie it into this legislation or into this program.
Well, I think my frame of reference is New York, which is very big on rent control. But they also have a tremendous amount of housing. And I hesitate to call it public housing, but they have a tremendous amount of housing that is city-owned and controlled. So that's my frame of reference. So, Alderman Schennemeyer.
In regards to rent control and its overall impact on housing costs and policy, separate from accessory dwelling units entirely, rent control is a very good way to stabilize a dramatic upshift. It is not an effective long-term strategy for housing costs, because one of the fundamental issues for why housing costs go up so dramatically is supply and demand, where these areas have a very high population that is demanding a place to live and a lower supply of housing stock than those people. So it's a good way to kind of put the brakes on dramatic increases. It is not a good long-term stable solution, though, because it prevents the construction of more housing, which doesn't end up addressing the root issue of why costs go up, or one of the primary root issues of why costs go up. In regards to accessory dwelling units, putting below market requirements on ADUs prevents them from getting built. We usually put these things in on developers who are putting in larger projects that are able to accommodate and shift those costs of the below market value onto other units, increasing their value to more than what the market rate would naturally be. Example, if we have 3 units that are would normally sell for market values at 100, then we make one go, okay, you can only sell for 90. The developers can spread those costs to the other 2 units and make them go for 105, so they still get that 300 value. They have room to play and deeper pockets to play. Accessory dwelling units are constructed by individual homeowners. They don't really have that ability to accommodate a below market rate unless it's for a family member or something. So it would be a poison pill amendment where we would essentially stop the construction of these while pretending like we did something. And, well, that just really make me mad. But that's just in regards to rent control and its overall power on housing.
Thank you. So the motion on the floor is that we give a favorable, did you make the motion?
It wasn't seconded.
Okay, we didn't have a second.
If it's failing for lack of
So,
second,
yeah.
I will make a motion that we not support amendment number 3.
And I will second that motion. Further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion to oppose Amendment 3. Did I say it right? Please say aye. Recommend unfavorable. Please say aye.
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 No.
Okay, amendment number 4, the Tierney Amendment. Alderwoman, you're here with us. Would you like to speak to this?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I think there are 4 different amendments that are all somewhat of the same nature as amendment number 4. I believe that amendment 4, amendment 6, amendment 8, and amendment 10 all speak to some version of it, and the general flavor is something that we've broached slightly in the earlier discussion, which is that accessory dwelling units are basically, as Alderman Schennemeyer said, a family proposition. It's supporting family members and in fact, oftentimes not charging any rent or some very low rent. And so it is accommodating relatives, it's accommodating people to allow you to age in place and those sorts of things. So I guess I'm asking you how we're going to digest those. We can vote on them as they come and then come back and figure out what we did, but I do think that there are several different versions to amend, and they're all going in the same place on page 5 of the ordinance.
Well, thank you for bringing that to my attention, Alderman. I'm going to ask if, with your indulgence, that we move to Amendment 6. Amendment 6 is the amendment from the Economic Matters Committee, which does speak to ownership and residence. And then as we get to the others, we can determine which ones have already been considered. Alderman Savage?
Yeah, thank you.
So we're
Madam-
on amendment number 6.
Madam Chair, that's what I was going to suggest, so thank you. Because I
Great
think
minds.
6, that's right, 6 was what we came up with for Alderman Arnett's information. 6 is what we came up with from Economic Matters, basically refining the language in Alderman Tierney. I hope you're okay with that. But we came up with this. We hope it's, we thought that it better met the intention of what you were trying to do, but I guess now that you're here, you can find out for sure.
I think, may I?
Alderwoman, yes.
Thank you. On Amendment 4, it was from Montgomery County, and the objective was, it was very simple that the owner lives there, and it wasn't so much morphing into any sort of short-term rental issue. It was just this, we didn't want them to be investment properties. I can say that I think Amendment 6 would supersede it. So if I may, I would introduce a motion to withdraw Amendment 4 and have Amendment 6.
We'll come back to that. Right
Okay,
now,
cool.
we're on amendment number 6.
Okay, all right.
Alderman Schnellmeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So amendment number 6 actually hurts the construction of these overall by requiring an owner occupancy. It's another financing issue, especially if, let's say, an owner is living on their property when they initially construct this accessory dwelling unit, and then they wish to move to another property and they want to long-term rent both units. I do not see that as a big issue and would increase the overall housing stock for the renters. And banks usually agree when it comes to financing of these as well. I don't see this as killing the bill, but if we are looking at this for how we can try to provide best practices and flexibility, Amendment 6 would put a dampener upon this. I did actually ask to have my name removed, but because it was a committee amendment, I could not.
To have your name removed, did you say?
From 6, but because it was a committee amendment, I could not, is
okay.
what I was told. So my name is on there with duress.
Okay. Alderman Savage?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so with this amendment, I guess it does a bit more than what Alderwoman Tierney's amendment would do. So besides having, it would require common ownership, and that is one thing I have, I do have some, I guess, more thoughts and questions on that. Because I think it would preclude a situation which what Alderman Schnellmeyer alluded to, and I know there are a number of people in the city who have situations like this, may own multiple properties, and I guess I'm just thinking, and maybe this is more for Alderwoman Tierney, I think the one thing we would probably want to prevent is somebody buying up properties and lots and just turning this into, in this case, they could, I guess, turn it into just a bunch of short-term rentals or other rental properties. But then again, that might not be a bad thing if we have more rental properties, just to have a diversity of housing type in the city. I'm just kind of thinking this out loud because this kind of thing just occurred to me today when I was thinking more about it. I mean, the other part of the amendment has to do with requiring that the owner shall reside in one of those, and it's definitely connected in the sense that, again, there are some properties here where they're rented out long term, and and some of them are accessory dwelling units, but the owner doesn't live there. So I'm just trying to wrestle with that in my head. Is that something we really want to quash? So I guess one of my questions would be, is there a clear problem I'm not fully aware of that we're trying to solve by this, or that we're trying to prevent from happening with this kind of...
Is that directed to me? Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I think you originally
Yeah, I think
introduced it.
6 kind of, I mean, I'm willing to use, I'm getting the numbers screwed up, 6 could be a little bit of overkill there, but my concern was market-driven. We're in a trifecta here. We have the entire city. We have the Naval Academy, we have the water, and we have the historic district, and we are the city of Annapolis, and people like to come here. So I believe that these accessory dwelling units will be very popular for short-term, under 90-day rentals, short-term rentals. I just believe that, and plus, they'll make $2,000 in a weekend versus $2,000 in a month. So there you have it. Anyways, with that said, it's a prime candidate for investment, and somebody could just list it on VRBO, for 90 days, or vacation rentals, or summer rentals. Eastport, for example, it would be an ideal application. Eastport mostly for a summer beach house, and so that's where I just thought that the owner should be there, it should be owner occupied. The objective was to prevent investment. I think 6 really locks that in, so, and I don't mean to speak for Eastport, but that's a
I think you did it well, but
lessons learned.
the very scenario that Alderman Schandelmeyer mentioned is what I'm concerned about. If someone owns a house, develops an accessory dwelling unit, and then sells it, and both of those are independent, that's no longer an accessory dwelling unit in my mind. That's a two-family dwelling unit, and they are independent. They can be bought and sold independently. There's no doubt it would increase the housing stock potentially some, but now you're getting into an entirely different part of the code, and that's why when I did this PowerPoint presentation that I shared with all of you, I think that definitions are important. And to me, accessory dwelling unit is secondary to the principal household. It's a mechanism, it's kind of a family use mechanism. The principal resident can make space for other family members, young people moving into town, caregivers for allowing people to age in place, things like that, or simply to defray their living expenses, not just their mortgage, but any living expenses. But as soon as you get into having 2 different units, you're now no longer a accessory dwelling unit, you're a two-family dwelling unit, as defined in the code, and two-family dwelling units are generally treated as multifamily dwelling units, and I can give you these.
Sorry, could you say that again? What makes it considered a
When you
But we don't
move
get
to having
highlighted
it,
copies, I'm just.
when you move it from being the principal resident, this is for Takia, then and you can build the accessory dwelling unit, and then sell it, and both become rental units, you're really now a two-family dwelling unit. And so now, instead of allowing in the code in single-family zones something that is a family supporting kind of a thing, you're basically converting all single-family zones to the ability to be two-family zone. And if you follow the example in Minneapolis, you can then be four-family units. So, it basically extinguishes the right and the desire for people to have single-family homes in a single-family neighborhood. Now, maybe that ultimately is the goal, maybe that's a new generational goal, but it isn't the goal of the people who are already enfranchised here in the city. And that's one of my problems with this legislation is it's so omnibus, so all encompassing, and basically changes the rules for the people who are already here. Now, limiting it to ownership, which both you and Ellie, I'm kind of hard to believe, given your arguments on short-term rentals, that you wouldn't be sympathetic to this being an owner-occupied situation, it's hard to fathom, but I think that you now clearly have moved into a different kind of situation. You're moving into two-family dwelling units. And that's why if you think Amendment 6 is overkill, when you get to my Amendment 8, you may really not like it, but it makes that part. Yeah. So I think it's very important, if we're going to establish accessory dwelling units as a mechanism that families can use to help their situation in a multitude of different ways, and in the process, particularly if it's a long-term rental situation, help increase the stock of housing. Hopefully, although again, this question about accessory dwelling units versus affordable housing is very easily confused and convoluted, but hopefully we will have that as available to families. It will allow them to get into homes. Maybe they'll get into homes that they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford immediately, but with these kinds of additional incomes and so forth. But to me, that's pretty critical. That's why, as I said at the beginning before we opened up the meeting, I would be willing to vote right now to recommend the legislation as submitted favorably. But I do think it's important that we establish this definition of the kinds of ways, the kinds of people it's available to. And to me, accessory dwelling units is a family home ownership mechanism, not an investment mechanism. I can see, in fact, I have happening on my very block, a house that is being built with a major 2.5-car garage with a 2-bedroom space over it, and also an independent basement unit, one or the other of which would not be legal if this legislation is passed, but by a speculator, by a person that got the house very cheaply and is turning it into a major rental source. Now, ultimately, maybe that's what Alderman Chandlemeyer and Alderman Gay want to see, and that's fine. That's not my druthers, but I think that by not requiring this home ownership, we're opening this up to the very kinds of investors coming in, buying these houses, making them into multiple units, selling them, moving on, and pricing people out of the market because they can afford, as an investment property, to pay at the top of the market. So I think that this opens up the door for some really significant displacement and drive the unaffordable housing prices even higher. So that's why I think that either Amendment 6, I prefer Amendment 8, which I worked with Dr. Nash and the Office of Law on, is pretty critical to this legislation.
Well, right now, Amendment 6 is the one that's on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
Alderman Chandlemeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Amendment 6 is the common ownership definition is, I think, unnecessary because by the very nature of a single-family lot, you cannot break it down and split it into multiple units. So it's redundant, it's unnecessary. I don't think it hurts it being in common ownership, but it does not do anything. The residency requirement, if we're providing 2 units of long-term rental housing that are owned by the same owner, I do not see why this is a big issue. As for the idea that I'm changing the rules and taking away neighborhoods is frankly silly. If someone does not want to have if someone does not want to have an accessory dwelling unit, there is nothing in this bill that requires them to build it. However, I gotta say, why do you have the right to tell what your neighbor can and can't do with their property? That's frankly nuts. And I just gotta really fundamentally address this will cause more housing, which will displace people. You're an economist, man. You know supply and demand. Displacing and increasing the cost of housing is because there is a high demand and a low supply. That is what causes these displacements and rapid costs in housing. And there's so many scientific data, so much scientific sources in urban planning manuals that show this is correct. From things like Strong Towns to Missing Middle Housing to the Brookings Institute. Like, it's the exact opposite of the situation you described.
As an economist, first of all,
Thank you.
I did not call you silly. I did not make any pejorative statements to you, and I would appreciate it if you wouldn't make them in my direction.
Okay, gentlemen, let's,
If we allow,
okay, Alderman Gay may be Skyping in. Do we have the ability to have two people on Skype at once? Okay, they won't hear each other. Okay.
if
Okay,
we-
the amendment on the floor is amendment number 6. I think we've had adequate discussion. Alderman Savage,
Just one quick point. Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, it's a little feedback on the without the cover. Would be, I guess, if we're concerned about these becoming investment properties without this amendment, one thing to do would be to ban them from being used for short-term rentals, because then they would have to be used as long-term rentals in some fashion. Just throwing that out there.
isn't that what our previous motion on Amendment 3 did?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
But
I'm just pointing that
You didn't
out.
support that.
Yeah.
yeah. I'm
But
just
that's-
pointing that out because if that passes, then there's
I may-
less fear, I think, of
Okay.
If we don't have this home ownership and we allow people to come in, redevelop properties and put in multiple units and then sell them, we are encouraging the speculators, the same arguments that were the worry with the short-term rentals. And I think as an economist, a practicing economist, that's going to drive the price of housing up even faster than it's going up now. Because you're going to have people with money, not a long-term investment in the community, investment in redeveloping them, flipping them, and turning them over. And I think that by having this be a family mechanism where the accessory dwelling units are for the primary resident and have all the other benefits that it can have in terms of creating it, including providing some housing that might not be as expensive, that we accomplish the goal of accessory dwelling units. If we're going to get into, you can buy a house, add a unit, rehab it, and flip it, I think we're opening up a door that is even maybe more frightening than the short-term rental, which I think has got its problems too.
Okay, I'm going to call the question as the chair on amendment number 6. All in favor, the motion is to give a favorable recommendation to, we did have a, no, I'll need a motion.
Move.
Well, I think Madam Chair, could we wait until we get to the, kind of like to compare it with the other amendment that would do something similar, Amendment 8, before we decide on this one?
Yeah.
Well, we moved ahead to deal with this one. Which one are you talking about? You're
8.
talking about
8.
Alderman Arnett's
Yeah.
number 8?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is no motion on the floor, correct? Okay. All right, so if your pleasure is to go to number 10, which was the definition, and I was going to propose that we
8.
go to the definition first.
8 is the,
No, 10 is the definition. I thought we should
okay,
put a
you're right.
definition on the
That goes
books
into
first.
different part of Title 21. You're correct.
Pardon me?
You are correct. 10 goes to a different part of Title 21.
Right, and then come back to number
So-
8.
So 10 is what I worked out with Dr. Nash, Jacqueline Lee, and Michael Lyles, and we had a conference call on this. And this is what was recommended from the Office of Law, from that discussion. I'm not saying that Dr. Nash subscribes to this, but she did help me in thinking through it. So you're right, that would go into the definition section of Title 2172, where all the other definitions are held.
Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to, on Amendment 10 first.
So moved.
What's the motion?
I'll second
Amendment
that.
10.
But what's the motion?
The motion is to give a favorable recommendation to
Okay,
Amendment
all you
10.
said was so moved, that's all.
Okay, sorry. Do I get a second?
I'll second, but I'm just reading through it again.
Okay. And this, to be clear, this is to simply add a definition of accessory dwelling units to
Correct.
Chapter 21. Alderman Schnellmeyer,
I have no issues whatsoever with Amendment 10. It's a pretty good definition.
thank you.
Let's vote.
Well, I do have questions about this one.
Okay, Alderman Savage.
So for this one, and this might be, so for this, my question has to do with, right now it doesn't set any kind of, I mean, there's the inherent size that's in the legislation of the 850 square feet, unless it's actually part of the building, which is one of the Alderman Schnellmeyer's amendments. But other than that, so in this case, even for those that are attached, accessory dwelling units that are attached, or say there's a larger structure where they're kind of separated out, there's nothing in this definition that even just clarifies that accessory dwellings have to be smaller than the primary dwelling. Because, I mean, I think we brought this up at Economic Matters with Dr. Nash, like, what's the point of having it be called accessory? If it's going to be the same size, they might as well just call it a multifamily duplex or something like that. It kind of seems like there should be something in here indicating that it has to at least be, I don't know, I think I threw out like 10% smaller than the primary structure. So I'm kind of looking at Dr. Nash for any kind of
Dr.
feedback
Nash?
on that.
This amendment did specifically not include a percentage, but I think that the sponsor could probably speak to that, because I know we discussed it, but I think the problem was we couldn't quite land on a number.
What we specifically talked about was 850 square feet, or 1/3 of the floor space, whichever is less. But it was hard for me to, and this was really protracted discussions with the city attorney, Mr. Lyles, to really know the impact of that.
And that is Amendment 9 as well. So.
Right. So that, we left that out of both the Amendment 8 and Amendment 10, but Amendment 9 was what was suggested by the Office of Law.
Well, let me ask Dr. Nash, and then I'll get to you, Alderman Schnellmeyer. What would the impact be if we passed Amendment 10 and did not pass Amendment 9?
So if we pass Amendment 10, then any accessory structure that is detached, so you're going to build one in your yard, it would have to meet the same setbacks and all other requirements of any other accessory structure, which is sort of implied now, but I wanted to make sure we tied it closely to the bulk regulations table in the code. The accessory structures cannot be larger than the principal structure. They have to be smaller, but the code does not define how much smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Clarifying question.
Yeah, Alderman.
So the code, you're saying the code currently has something, it says something where the accessory dwelling unit has to be smaller than the primary?
It says, I think it says subservient to the principal use.
Yeah, of course, that's not necessarily defined either. I think we said this last time. It could be
That's right.
a foot smaller and still be considered. I mean, maybe I'm being too stickler for the details here, but that just seems to me, it just seems too close to being again, a multifamily kind of duplex as compared to just accessory. I feel like there should be more of a distinction between
Well,
what's truly accessory.
just to clarify,
subservient.
multifamily is 3 or more. I understand your point, but I just wanted to
Okay,
clarify.
thank you. Well, duplex then, in that
Right.
case. But, you know, and I guess this is linked to Amendment 9. If I could ask about something related to that, in terms of the size, it says, so this would address that to a certain degree.
I'd prefer we deal with 10 first, if we might, and then,
Okay,
you know, all of these are so closely
Yeah.
intertwined. But if we can dispatch with 10 first, and then we can come back to deal with 8 and 9.
okay, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to vote on 10.
Because
Unless
it does not
nine's
have
gonna-
the,
Unless
8,
nine's
9,
going to address
10
my
were-
concern.
They were developed in conjunction with each other,
Yeah.
so I understand.
If
Yeah.
that makes sense.
yeah, it does, because Dr. Nash just said in the bulk regulations, it says what smaller than. And so if you're not satisfied with whatever smaller than means, then
Yeah.
you need Amendment 9 to clarify it. But we're going to have to take one of these before the other, so I'm pushing for taking 10 first. Alderman Chettelmeyer, I'm sorry, I didn't get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So to kind of assuage your fear on why isn't this a duplex is an entirely different unit type where the units can be sold, bought and sold, and treated as separate things. An accessory structure, even if it is attached, is still entirely connected by the primary owner of the lot. It's why the common ownership amendments that were put in, I said, don't really hurt or help the bill. They just kind of clearly state the thing that the zoning code already puts down. So in regards to that front, that's why this is separate from a duplex. The subservient size, I'll keep my powder dry for Amendment 9.
The
but
most unique adjectives,
It's,
subservient size, that doesn't give any negative connotation at all.
well, I was actually about to say I liked the word choice, and I will keep my powder dry for Amendment 9.
And we see that Alderman Gay has joined us. So welcome to the political wranglings of accessory dwelling units.
Hey, buddy.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very nice to see you. Y'all know I'm having that battery issue, so.
You need to be louder.
Can you move a little closer to your mic?
I said, so nice to see you all. You know I'm having that battery issue.
Okay, so the motion on the floor is Amendment 10. And has it been moved and seconded?
I'll move.
Did you move it?
Yeah, I did.
It's been
It's
moved
been
and
moved and
seconded.
I think I
Okay.
seconded it, yeah.
So I'm calling it all in favor of, it was a favorable recommendation for Amendment 10.
Aye.
Please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. All right, so let's go back now. I thought we were going back to 6, but I guess we're going back to 8. Alderman Arnett, your Amendment 8, which speaks to common ownership, as well as, what's the other part of that?
I think the difference.
Owner occupied.
The difference between 6 and 8 is this added clause that says they can't be purchased or sold independently of each other. I think Alderman Chandelmeyer has already said that implicitly they can't be, and I accept that, but I thought it was important to be explicit in that regard. because I do think there is potential being confused between two-family duplex and accessory dwelling units. And so in the discussion, and these three amendments were developed all together in the meeting with Dr. Nash and the Office of Law, and with input from the the city attorney backing that up. So it was an attempt to be much more explicit than either 4 or 6 were about they can't be separately sold.
Okay, so is that in the form of a motion to give a
I
favorable
would make that-
recommendation from 8?
I would make that motion, yes.
And is there a second?
Second.
Second. Further discussion. Alderman Savage and then Alderman Schnellmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm open to this amendment as proposed. I think I like the additional language. I'm still kind of torn on it though, honestly, because I don't think having a few investment properties in the city is a bad thing. I don't want it to get out of control, but I think having a few, for example, like VRBOs that are around isn't too bad. I think it's just a problem again when it makes up too high of a percentage on a certain block or community. But I do think it's, so I don't know, that's kind of where I am with this.
Alderman Schnellmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So take my mild discontent with 6 and amplify it slightly with 8. And the reason is entirely because of this one sentence in it. The owner shall reside in the principal structure. So that takes away a lot of flexibility from the homeowner that may wish to downsize based upon age or need, or just not wanting to upkeep an entirely large property while still residing on that actual lot. And it will prevent them from residing in the accessory structure and renting out that primary one. Now, I already have disagreements with owner occupancy requirements in either of the structures because I do think that hurts flexibility and I do not see the same issues as with 2 longer-term rental properties. But forcing requirement of the owner in the primary structure takes away a lot of flexibility and choice from homeowners.
Alderman Savage and then Alderman Arnett.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Alderman Schnellmeyer there because I do think having that flexibility is important. I was thinking about that related to a different amendment as well, because again, some of the places I've stayed in are owner occupied, and the owner was on another floor and potentially smaller unit, but some of the other units, floors were rented out as rentals in some fashion. So, yeah, I think that's a valid argument. If somebody, if they own an age in place on their property and they may want to just move into having well, unfortunately, most likely it'd be short-term rentals, not long-term at that point, but you never know. They may want to bring in long-term rentals. And that, again, depends on what other amendments pass on this in terms of maintaining flexibility or not.
So for
Alderman Arnett?
So to both of my colleagues, if we strike the word principal, which I think turns it back closer to 6, I'm comfortable with that. So I would offer that we just strike the word, shall reside in the structure, so we take out that word principal. That way the owner has the option of whichever one they want to be in.
I would downgrade my resistance from militant to my similar resistance to Amendment 6.
Okay.
Okay, sounds like a compromise. I like it. Alderman Gay.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Yeah, I'm completely opposed to having the owner reside in any structure. As I kind of agree with my colleague. That's why I wanted to jump on so quickly to support him from Ward 5 as it relates to, just the possibilities. I'll throw out this perspective. If you own a property, let's say on Wells Avenue or whatever, and you have the primary structure, 3-bedroom, 1 bath, and you want to rent that out for, $1,800 or $1,900 a month. I know that's low, and I said that purposely because you want to rent it affordably. And you have the option to long-term rent that to a single mother of two, who really needs a affordable and quality place to live, while also renting your accessory dwelling unit to a college student at an affordable price of $825 a month. I mean, you get the best of both worlds as it relates to housing options. I understand you believe that undermines the single family zoning, but nothing changes of the physical structure. It's just the number of families living on the property. And in most cases, it would still be single family. You have one extra resident living in an accessory dwelling unit. So I think it's quite a reach to say that we're undermining single family zoning. And I just don't think owners should be required to live in either structure.
Thank you. Alderman Channelmeyer.
I also want to add something on that we're putting a lot of concern over single-family zoning, having multiple families live in a lot that's zoned for that. We actually already have that situation going on where a lot of multiple families need to live in a single-family zoned structure in order to afford it. So it's more accurate definition in our current day and age, I think, would be single-unit zoning. So.
Okay, the motion on the floor is an amendment to the amendment,
Sorry, technically this would be Amendment 11, because this one is going to become. 12. Where's 11?
We already got Amendment 11.
Oh, so it's not uploaded. So then this would be 12.
We can't just amend this amendment?
No.
You all do use different Robert's Rules of Orders, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Because this isn't your amendment.
It's his amendment, and he's the one that's amending it. Ross is, Alderman Arnett. It's his amendment, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we don't need to debate. It's his amendment.
Yeah.
And his amendment to his amendment.
I'm just saying, in my amendment 8, strike the word principal.
Exactly.
And so the motion is to recommend favorably from the committee, amendment 8 with the word principal stricken from the definition.
Second.
And that's been moved and seconded. Okay?
Can I comment
We'll
on?
fight it over later. Alderman Savage.
So I am going to vote in favor of this, but I will just say I'm not entirely sure yet how I might vote on the final, when this comes up for final vote, just in light of Alderman Gay's comments, because again, I do know at least one person who has property that has primary structure with accessory dwelling unit. They don't live there, but they do rent it out as long-term rentals, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But if we pass this, this would kind of prevent that from happening. So that said, I'm reserving my final vote, as Alderwoman Finlayson sometimes says, but for now, I'll vote in favor.
All right.
Okay, so the motion on the floor is Amendment 8 with the change that the term principal in line 3 is stricken. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. Okay, Amendment 9 speaks to the size of the unit, and we had a cursory discussion on this earlier. This speaks to 800 square feet. Alderman Arnett, this is your amendment also.
So, yes, so this was something that actually was suggested by the city attorney, and it's copying apparently legislation from the county. I'm not sure of that myself. And it is that it makes 850 square feet the maximum size. So this would be directly antithetical to Alderman Schalnemeyer's amendment number 1. That's what this amendment is. So it is if the total floor space of the building is 1,000 square feet, and there are some in Ward 8, then that would mean that it would be a third of 1,000 square feet. If the total floor space is 4,000 square feet, and there's a lot in Ward 8, then that would mean that 1/3 of 4,000 is greater than 850, so 850 would be the limit of the size of the units. I would just report that 850 square feet in many urban areas is actually a pretty large residential unit.
Alderman Schnellmeyer.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and none of them are positive. I think this goes back. If something is established in an area that already has a footprint, it does not really matter. It doesn't add to the construction of the area. It doesn't add to any kind of environmental impact. It's just a slightly larger structure. It's just another unit inside an existing structure. The word subservient was used, and I think that sums up how I view this. It is a way to go, you, dweller of accessory dwelling unit, are subservient to the primary. I know that's a very dramatic way to phrase it, but I think this amendment is bad.
Thank you.
And actually, I got a little more to go on. Like, this can actually add to the cost overall of building these things, because you have to close off existing space and an already existing structure. You have to build up walls and limit the space, and that can add to overall construction costs for a conversion. This also prevents these from being built effectively in smaller structures. If you have a unit with an 850 square foot footprint overall, with like a basement and a top unit, it effectively forces you to put in the smallest of structures in that basement or for the accessory dwelling structure. And when you combine that with the basic standards of our code, where families need to have 150 square feet minimum of livable space and then an additional 100 feet for additional resident, it kind of outlaws these in tinier structures for a reason that I don't see a point in.
Alderman, with all of your research, I'm surprised you haven't seen trends, current trends of these smaller living facilities.
Tiny homes. Yes, I am very aware of tiny homes, but those tend to be people who choose to live in that situation, not the government going, you can only live in this situation unless you can afford that primary structure. That is one of my issues with this. If someone chooses to build a very small accessory dwelling unit of 150 square feet and an individual chooses to live in it, free market America, wonderful. But the government going, no, because you have a smaller home, and so it can only be a third of the size of your smaller home, that does not sit right with me.
Thank you. Is there a motion?
I move we recommend favorably on amendment number 9.
I'm kind of torn also. Alderman Savage, yeah.
I mean, I'll second it just so we can have discussion, but more, I guess, a question for Dr. Nash. Is there a consequence of not seeing, like, if Amendment 10 passes but 9 doesn't? I mean, the consequence, I guess, would just be that some of the ADUs are going to be larger than. And then my other question would be, well, yeah, I guess that's my first question. Yeah.
If you passed 10 but not 9, then the accessory structure is it could be the size of anyone if they wanted to build a garage with an office above it. You know, there could be There just wouldn't be a limit on the size, other than it would have to be smaller than the principal structure. That's really the only consequence.
Okay. And how would we handle the situations where there is an existing garage with essentially an ADU up above? So if it's existing, and I know we have a lot, we've seen pictures around the city. If they're larger than this 850 square feet, would they be able to get a permit to be a legitimate ADU, or would they have to keep doing it essentially under the radar?
Unless there was additional language introduced, they wouldn't be able to have a legal ADU.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
Alderman Arnett?
I'm arguing almost against myself here, but Alderman Savage, the committee has already voted favorably on amendment number 1. So if you don't vote for amendment number 9, you have amendment number 1, which basically says 850 square feet or bigger if that's the floor that you're redeveloping. So again, I like amendment 9. I wouldn't have offered it, but I think that the honest answer to you is, if you accept amendment number 1, then you probably shouldn't accept amendment number 9. If you like amendment number 9 better than amendment number 1, we have to go back and revisit amendment number 1. But I don't think it does damage to 8 or 10, because you've already got something that the committee's agreed on. Not unanimous, but they agreed on it.
Dr. Nash?
I just wanted to clarify that Amendment 1 only applies to accessory dwelling units in a principal structure. So I'm thinking like a basement apartment. It wouldn't apply to accessory dwelling units in an already existing accessory structure.
Like a garage?
Like a garage.
Right.
So in other words, that 850 feet would only apply to those that are not a part of the primary structure, right?
That limit, if there was an existing space. That's right.
Right, okay.
So, I mean, the amendment, again, unsolicited advice, you can cut my mic if you want, but you could amend Amendment 1 to also include existing accessory structures.
Right now, we're on amendment 9.
Madam Chair.
So what would be your pleasure? What would be the easier fix? Alderman Schenmeyer. Oh, I'm sorry, Alderman Gay, didn't hear you.
No, you're fine. I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
No, say that again.
Can you hear me now?
A little better, not much.
I'm sorry. I just had a quick question. If 9 passes, will it overrule 1?
Your question is, if 9 passes, would it overrule 1?
Mm-hmm.
We would have to go back and revisit 1, I guess.
And
Because they'd be
so
contradictory.
and so without Amendment 9, you could potentially build an accessory dwelling unit up to, I guess, as long as it's smaller than the principal unit. So it could be, I don't know, a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom on the lot, as long as it's smaller, right?
As long as it's smaller than the original.
And if Amendment 10 is passed, it meets all of the bulk regulations for accessory structures. So it would be pretty difficult to fit something that size on a
So
lot.
I think you make a very good point, Director Nash. So if Amendment 1's already passed, if Amendment 9 fails, Amendment 10 would create, regulations and requirements so that you could not exceed, 1, the size of the principal unit, and 2, go overboard with overruling the bulk regulation requirements and stuff. So it would still have some regulation for the structure size itself.
That's right.
Okay.
Yes, fortunately, we're here and not listening and trying to follow this from home. Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you. I'm just following this. I think Amendment 10, since it's Title 21, is very absolute. And so I would suggest that if you make a decision on 10, you evaluate the other amendments accordingly. And also, I'm fearing what's going to happen to this is what happened to Dwan's marijuana bill. We're going to have these compounded amendments and then we have nothing. But I think if there is an amendment that is tied to another amendment, we have to say that right away. Right, so this, but again, Amendment 10 is really, is what you need to establish, and then you work from that.
So
Well, that's why we took Amendment 10 first, because it
Right.
goes into definitions.
Clear.
And we had said that we would try to take them in order so that there's not a contradiction of
Madam
other
Chair,
legislation, or other amendments. Alderman Arnett?
I'm sensing the quandary of my colleagues. The majority of the committee already approved amendment number 1. I will be, if you're uncomfortable with 9, I can withdraw it, and I think we're okay.
Okay. It's your amendment, so.
Well, I mean, I'll be happy to sit here and hear you vote it down, but.
If it meets the needs,
Well,
we
I
can
actually did
withdraw
this
amendment.
for Alderman Savage because we talked about it when I talked to the Office of Law. This is what they came up with. But amendment, I'm not uncomfortable with amendment number 1. I think it also accomplishes a purpose. So to move forward and to ease your angst, I will be happy to withdraw amendment number 9.
Okay, does there need to, it's his amendment, it's the first time it's being presented, so it's our committee, so you can withdraw it.
This is why they call it sausage making, right?
Well, I take Alderwoman Tierney's point. If we have all of these pig-piled on each other convoluted things, you've already approved Amendment 1. This is contradictory to it. You're not comfortable with it. I withdraw it.
Okay, well, let's go on. Let's try to get back up now and address the ones that are still have some, that we haven't talked about. So 4 is the Tierney Amendment, which I think is already included in, is that 10?
Mm-hmm.
So Alderwoman Tierney, are you going to withdraw Amendment 4?
Okay, maybe I'm confused. I thought 8 said it better.
That's not my question.
Well, I want to know if there's something
We
left.
approved 8.
We've
The committee
approved 8 and we've
Okay.
approved
Yeah.
10.
Thank you for that clarification. If you've recommended 8, then I can withdraw 4.
Okay, so 4 is being withdrawn.
Thank you.
And then 6 is,
Okay, so 6 is the one,
that I think 8 would subsume
yeah,
also.
we had started the discussion on 6 and then went to 10.
What was your vote on
So
2?
that's the amendment that came from Economic Matters. Alderman Schenemeyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the purposes of flexibility, I'm not a fan of either, but I think for the purposes of flexibility, I'm leaning towards 6 because it at least explicitly says that they can reside in the secondary structure. Dr. Nash, am I being paranoid where if it doesn't explicitly say it's okay, there will be a fine if they do not?
Didn't we correct this with the amendment by removing the term principal?
Yeah, I don't know. I
did.
might be being paranoid here, but I like the explicit permission of 6 more than the implicit permission of 8. But they do, with the principal with the reside in the principal structure thing removed it.
That's a good question. I don't know if it'd be best answered by Dr. Nash or Ms. Leonard.
So your question for Dr. Nash was what?
Which of these is less likely?
You need to be on the microphone, Alderman.
Well, if I could, so Amendment 8, we did remove principal, so it says or owned independently from the structure. And I think Alderman Schneidermeyer's fear is that that doesn't specify what structure. So whereas Amendment 6 does say it can be either primary.
They're very similar as after the removal of after the requirement of residing in the primary structure. I feel a little calmer with all of my previous oppositions raised still in tow with 6 by allowing the explicit permission.
I would say, yes, they're very similar. I think the word structure, shall reside in the structure, is a little ambiguous. I mean, I know what you mean just because I've been in this meeting, but in 5 years from now, is someone going to be saying, what does structure mean?
Are you saying in 6 that it's redundant?
No, I'm saying 6, for me, 6 is a little bit more clear.
In that regard.
But it might be a question for the law office, you know, to see.
So the,
Ms. Leonard's on the line. Ms. Leonard, are you following Amendment 6 and Amendment 8?
Yes, I'm listening to you. From a legal perspective, Amendment 6 is easier to enforce. It doesn't mean at Amendment 8 you couldn't get there, but Alderman Schneidermeyer and Director Nash are both correct that it is legally easier to force something that is explicit versus something that is implied.
so can I get a point of clarification?
Alderman Arnett, yes.
So the principal difference, there are some wording, but the principal difference between the two right now is that 8 explicitly says that the structures can't be sold independent of each other. Alderman Schneidermeyer has already proffered that they can't anyway. I guess I would ask the city attorney, is that a correct statement that if you have a single-family dwelling that has an accessory dwelling unit, is it not allowed to sell, say, the accessory dwelling building or the portion of...
You'd have to go through a formal subdivision process to sell them separately, which would be very unlikely to happen in this scenario.
And then there is a requirement for square footage to be able to subdivide, correct?
Right, to subdivide, you would need a certain amount of square footage, a certain amount of footage, because we wouldn't allow a flag lot. And you couldn't create any nonconformity with the subdivision.
Yeah, so for all practical purposes, it would be exceedingly hard to sell the two separately from each other.
So, Madam Chair?
Oh, Alderman, sorry.
I'm accepting, I want all of my colleagues to be comfortable, and so I would withdraw Amendment 8 in favor of supporting Amendment 6.
Okay. So is there a motion to give a favorable recommendation to Amendment 6?
I will move a favorable recommendation for 6, which will substitute our previous action on Amendment 8.
Well, he's withdrawing 8.
Just in case.
Just in case,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep. I second that motion.
Okay. Ms. Green, are we good? Okay, so all in favor of amendment?
Madam Chair.
Oh, I'm sorry, your hand's off the screen. I mean.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got a duck.
Alderman Gay.
Question. If, I think the city attorney just gave an excellent explanation to what has been the issue at the core. Are we undermining single-family housing? Will there be an opportunity to sell in the future? And she just very clearly said no. And the director of planning and zoning has backed that up, essentially saying the lots don't have the size, especially if you already have a construction a constructed ADU. The subdivision's application would fail. So what is the point of having the requirement of owner occupancy if this is very, very unlikely to ever happen?
Okay, thank you. Alderman Arnett.
You missed the discussion on that. The point is to stop speculation in housing where people come in, buy a single-family house, add an accessory dwelling unit, and then flip it. And that's what the intent here is. Just like in discussions with short-term rentals, we want the owner to live in the structure, whether it's in the principal structure, what is the word you don't like, Brooks?
Subservient.
Subservient structure, the secondary structure. 6 does not speak to that, 8 did, so I withdraw an 8 in order to try to get some things passed and keep peace in the family.
Yeah, I get the keeping peace, but I respect this rules and city government process. So obviously the committees has final saying, but I think that our colleagues should keep in mind when it comes to the floor that this is basically pointless. They've just said that there is no possible way that could happen moving forward.
Well, then it's not going to hurt anything.
Okay, so Amendment 6, I'll call the question. All in favor of giving
Aye.
a favorable recommendation, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Amendment 5.
and
Madam,
Amendment 5 is the Savage Amendment.
Madam Chair,
Yes, sir.
before we get to that,
No, we're not taking a break.
no, I was wanting to bring up a point from Dr. Nash about adding to the Amendment 1, if I can find it here, at the end, adding, I'm just trying to think about how we can deal with, and maybe that's addressed later, how to deal with grandfathering property, or not necessarily grandfathering, but again, those garage properties that have an ADU on the top, which we know there are plenty of, if they're larger than the size of the limitation we have here. Her idea was at the end of the Amendment 1 is to put, so basically it has to be established within the existing footprint of a principal structure or existing structure. That was the or she kind of suggested. Maybe if you want to take that up after the next
Yeah,
amendment.
let's take it after. A 20 by 40 garage would be a huge garage. I mean, that's 800, that's not even 850.
I had, my first home here was in above garage apartment. It was about 900 square feet above the garage. I guess this as written would have required like a little bit of long walk of things. I don't know, I'll think on a way to fix that because it's obviously something I think is fine, but I believe those situations are going to be a little more limited that basement apartments or apartments.
Yeah, I would just hate to have units continue to have to operate under the radar, because I think we all want to try to get them permitted and inspected.
Yeah.
So anyway, we could table that discussion though.
We can table that. I'll probably do another amendment or something.
Okay.
You are about to discuss Amendment number 5, however.
Okay. Amendment 5. Well, I think I kind of gave I'll reiterate because I know we talked about this a bit last time. But again, just in light of some of our goals and targets to reduce impervious surface and improve our water quality, I was trying to figure out a way to ensure that ADUs don't add to that, compound that problem. And so we came up with this language, which I think we spent quite a bit of time tweaking in environmental matters and then afterwards, which basically gave them, if they want to build or add an ADU, that they would have to work with the department to ensure that that new impervious surface is treated and that, or that they end up reducing impervious surface elsewhere on their property. This is similar to what is done in the critical area regulations. Yeah, so I'll take any
So is
other.
that in the form of a
questions?
motion to give a favorable recommendation to Amendment 5?
Okay, I'll move favorable recommendation for Amendment 5.
Second.
And it's seconded. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just trying to get you
It's
to move
okay.
it
I
along.
know it's getting late. I'm already getting texts from.
Alderman Arnett and then Alderman Chandler.
So I guess my question is, are the meanings of the word treatment or managed, is that like you would add a rain garden or something? So those are standard words that the department would be able to understand, just like with stormwater management or critical area? Okay.
Should
thanks
we
for that.
ask Dr. Nash that question?
Right, well, we have, for critical area and IDA, we do have a list of practices people can do, like rain barrels or rain gardens. I'm not sure we would know exactly how to figure out how much they should provide, but we could probably just do what we do in the critical area and use the same thought process there.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify, this would, the way it's worded, it would only apply to essentially new construction, and not like an existing property where there's an existing structure. It's just new.
I'm looking for that in the language, and I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, I don't see that either.
Well, but the first, it says the addition of an impervious surface shall not be allowed. So if it's an existing structure, it wouldn't be an addition, it'd be an existing.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think that's inclusive.
Alderman Chandler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do think this is a good direction towards more environmentally sustainable building types. I do really want to say that without Amendment 2, which we are mandating an extra amount of impervious asphalt through it, this can be more difficult for homeowners to build. And so I like this amendment a lot when combined with Amendment 2.
Well, we have not supported Amendment 2, so we are only dealing with Amendment 5 right now.
I know, just pointing out, we already said let's put more impervious surface on by not supporting 2, so.
Madam Chair?
So, Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could I just offer a little bit of clarity on this? If, and I want to avoid a double negative, on the parking requirement, you did not recommend that, so therefore, you would prefer adding a parking, and as Brooks said, as Alderman Schaudemeller said, you're introducing more. That, to my mind, that would mean that this amendment is even more important. Is that correct? Because you're introducing, if the applicant would have to provide perhaps an impervious surface for parking, therefore, they would have to, if your amendment was not recommended, it would be adverse to the environment, correct? So with your amendment recommended, you have you can address that impervious surface. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think, I think to both your points, if I understand correctly, if Amendment 2 doesn't pass, and this makes this even more important in that sense.
Correct.
There would be additional parking
Correct.
surfaces that we would have to treat. So yes.
That's my point. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay. Is there, it's been moved and seconded. Further discussion? Hearing none, seeing none. All in favor of giving a favorable recommendation to Amendment 5, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Well, I think
Nope.
that
Amendment
exhausts all
7.
of our uh-oh,
7 and 11.
7. Alderwoman Tierney. Oh, that's the very lengthy.
Oh, no, it really isn't. Are you ready for me? Based on the public testimony, it was apparent that, and I think you would agree, that there seems to be a lot of these existing quote-unquote ADUs, even though they're not defined as ADUs, but a lot of people testify that they have an ADU, which which brought me to look at this, and also to my colleague, Alderwoman Pendle Charles, who's very concerned about her building inventory. So it would be nice to know what we have. To Alderwoman Finlayson's point, we can't inspect, we can't actively, go out there and inspect and enforce and do all that. So, the Assistant City Attorney, first Director Nash and I talked and said it would slow the input if we had this time, and then she suggested what this would be is an amnesty period, and that would be giving them amnesty, which is sort of an incentive to say, hey, by the way, I have an ADU. Otherwise, probably may not happen. I mean, that might be a fair assumption because they have a SDR license and they can continue. The other thing, and I don't want to sound dramatic, but the Ida flooding in New Jersey and New York, a lot of those deaths were caused by basement units. That is documented that they weren't inspected. And ADUs are supposed to have, ingress, egress. That stuff's really important. And so they should be inspected. And so that is what the objective is, this legislation, is for them ultimately to be inspected and licensed. To do that, then, there would be this amnesty period where they would apply, and if there's any sort of corrections, they're waived. How do I say this? They won't be charged any penalty. So it allows us to get a handle on what's out there before we essentially add any new ones.
Okay.
And this was Assistant City Attorney Ashley Leonard's research and product to do that.
Madam Chair, I would move that we recommend favorably on Amendment 7.
And second.
Okay, further discussion. All right, I'm sorry, Alderman Gay.
Just to be clear, there is no fine associated with, I don't want to say refusal, but if a individual does not come forward within the 90-day period, I hope we aren't fining them or anything like that.
Well, if they're in violation, if we find out afterwards, of course they'd be fined.
I think that's a bit excessive.
For clarity, this gives them 90 days of amnesty so that they will not be fined. 90 days is 3 months.
Alderman Arnett and then Chandler.
That does raise a question for Dr. Nash, which is, how will we advertise this amnesty program?
We can enlist our public information officer to put out information in Facebook and other social media, and it would be great if all of you could send out information in your news blasts as well.
Okay. All right.
Alderman Chandler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the 90 days, if someone came forward seeking a license outside of that 90-day amnesty process, unless we have evidence to the contrary, we can't say if they were in violation. So no fines could be issued unless, we found evidence of them being otherwise. So the 90 days is a good incentive point for people trying to get that license right away. And again, we don't know if someone comes in after that, what they were doing with that space.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think the Alderman from Ward 8 raised a great point about communications. Maybe some signs in public places or whatever, just to let people know. I think it's a lot to depend solely on social media and our network. There's so many people in this city that just aren't tied into those things. So I just think they take into consideration, but I don't.
Okay, seeing no further discussion, there's a motion to give a favorable recommendation to Amendment 7. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. And did we miss any?
11.
Oh, 11. And I don't have 11. Oh, thank you. Okay, Alderman Schnellmeyer, 11 is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is my, I guess, parachute for Amendment 3 in the likely event of that not passing, because I am more sympathetic and understanding of some of my colleagues' arguments against 3. There are a couple individuals in the city who currently have accessory structures that they are renting as short-term rentals. It's a pretty small number. A big example is Mr. Jay Antonelli, who came forward to us on Monday when we first brought the 0921 forward on second reader. And it would basically just allow, if you already have an operating rental license, like short-term rental license, and you have an accessory dwelling unit or an accessory structure, we're not going to take that away from you. It just lets people who are already relying on this as a source of income continue to have that. It's not adding to the short-term rental stock, it's just not taking it away from some people that are already dependent upon it. It's my attempts to help the people who have brought forward a very legitimate fear that their income may be lost without also compromising on the arguments pushed forward by my colleagues against Amendment 3.
Thank you. Alderman Savage and then Alderman Arnett.
Well, I guess my first question, maybe for Ms. Leonard, because the language, it says that any legally existing accessory dwelling unit as of the date of the passage, but we don't have any legal accessory dwelling units currently.
We
Right.
have some.
Oh, we do have some.
Mostly in the historic district where they've existed since before 1970. I suspect what there are, a lot of are legally licensed short-term rentals that are not supposed to be accessory dwelling units. They're supposed to be extra bedrooms, guest bedrooms, or, you know, a man cave when they were built and permitted. But there's a thin line between having a guest bedroom above your garage with a full bath, a microwave, and having, which we would allow, and having an accessory dwelling unit, which by definition has something like a stove or 220 power. But some people might portray their short-term rental as an accessory dwelling unit, even if it doesn't necessarily meet our code's definition of an accessory dwelling unit. That I would not consider a legal accessory dwelling unit. I would consider it maybe a legally licensed short-term rental, but not a legal accessory dwelling unit.
Do you have any concerns about this particular language? And same question for Ms. Leonard.
Oh, thank you. As long as we all understand that that there are not very many legally existing accessory dwelling units. So, you know, I'm not sure that would help the people that Alderman Schnellmeyer has in mind. I don't know, because I don't know of those, what he is, you know, the specifics of what he's talking about. You know, this would help people in the historic district who've always, or Eastport, that's where most of these are, where they've just been there for a long time. There was always, for some reason, 2 units there, and that's going to be continued.
The specific situation, oh, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I spoke out of turn.
Did she answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I think so. And if this is going to impact primarily wards 1 and 8, I kind of like to hear from our colleagues too at some point.
I think you asked for Ms. Leonard. Is she still with us? To also answer.
I'm still here. So I understand the purpose of it. I think you could tweak the language a little bit to say that any dwelling unit existing as of the date of the passage that legally meets these ADU requirements, something like that, instead of saying any legally existing ADU, which doesn't really exist at this point because ADUs aren't allowed at this point, so there wouldn't be any legally existing. But I think you could massage the language to get to Alderman Schneidermeyer's purpose, if that makes sense.
It does. Can you tell us again what the language should say?
All right, so this is just off the top of my head, but I would say any dwelling unit existing as of the date of this passage that legally meets the requirements of this ordinance to be ADU and that is operating as a short term can continue to do so. Something along those lines.
I think that would still leave us with the problem that a dwelling unit, these aren't dwelling units. If these are just short-term rentals that are basically like a bedroom that are being rented out, those are not something we consider dwelling units.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was trying to look up. I don't know if there's some other word we could use instead of dwelling unit. But like, I'm on both phones at the moment, so it's a little tough to look things up. But I mean, I don't know if I can fix it tonight, but I could look at that and come up with some better verbiage, not using dwelling unit, that could maybe get us there.
Alderman Schneidermeyer?
First off, I'm open to tweaking it here and there. So by all means, tweak it. What if I could address the reason I put the bill in, like the specific scenario? This applies to a very small amount of people. Again, a fellow who came in here, Mr. Jay Antonelli. This is a constituent of Alderman Fred Payone's, and I had a good conversation with Alderman Payone as well about his specific situation. He has a carriage house that at some point in time was converted into, I haven't gone inside it, so I don't know if it's got the stove or not, but he uses it as a short-term rental himself, as a way to afford to live in the city and send his kids to their schools. This would and he does have a proper, up-to-date short-term rental license in the city. And there are a couple other people with similar situations who have come forward to me. They already have these kind of vague gray area things that, depending on how we're looking at it, could be called, oh, it's an extra bedroom that they're just renting out, or extra space that they're renting out, or we could maybe call it a short-term rental, depending on how hard or critical we want to look. And they all have currently up-to-date operating short-term rental licenses. This would simply let them keep operating their thing that they've already come forward with legally, and not take it away, which the bill as written could. And I would hate to have accidentally hurt someone's income like that with something that I meant to do with the best of intentions. So I'm trying to grandfather them in a more narrow scope than Amendment 3, because other people are more uncomfortable with Amendment 3 as broad as it is.
I don't think I heard any great resistance to this. I think there is concern about the language that's used.
Yeah,
and I would like to propose that you take this back to the law department and have Ms. Leonard work with you on the language.
Sure.
And you bring it back to the full council.
Yeah, absolutely. If the law office can help us kind of sharpen and iron this out, cool.
Yeah.
I can put it on my to-do list for tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Alderman Arnett.
So, Dr. Nash, you mentioned the year 1970.
That was
there
a good year.
Pardon me?
Nothing.
Is that was there some legislation, because I have some 125 units in my ward that are in single-family houses, but they're multiple units, usually 3, sometimes 4, and 2 of them are 5 units. My next-door neighbor has 2 rental units in her house. She isn't renting them, but she says they were made legal in 1982. I would really like to know that, because this legislation leaves a question in my mind about what do we do with single-family houses that have 3 units or 4 units in them. Are we now making them illegal because they're exceeding 1 accessory dwelling unit?
Right. So Eastport, like downtown, has a lot of these situations where before the zoning code that we have now was enacted, which was in 1970, there was all these different kind of arrangements that kind of grew organically. If you have evidence that you have a legal nonconforming use, you may continue that use as long as you don't stop it for more than a year. So I suspect a good number of the ones you're referring to meet that definition.
Where is that in the code?
In nonconforming, the
In Title
nonconforming
21,
section.
Nonconforming.
There's probably also a handful of people
It's not
who've...
deemed nonconforming, is it?
It's not deemed nonconforming, no, it's just nonconforming. So it's legal nonconforming use is what we call them. We have those all over Ward 8 and Ward 1. So, some of them may be illegal situations, in which case we're happy to investigate those to the extent we can. But say someone has 3 units and they can show that they're legal nonconforming, then this ordinance will not affect the status of those 3 units. They can continue on with those units.
So if they're legal nonconforming, are they inspected?
If they have a rental license,
Right, but if they don't have a rental license, then I can tell you, some of the stairs that I went up, I think they need inspection. So I guess there's a whole question of this category of buildings, which all seem to be buildings that were built in the 20s and 30s, and I would suspect were bought and converted when they were relatively inexpensive. But I think in terms of Title 17 and our life safety obligation, I would really like to see these units inspected and brought up to code if they are not in code.
if they're being rented out, they should have a rental license, but in some cases, people are using them for an office or something like that, in which case we wouldn't necessarily need a rental license.
Now, these have 3 mailboxes for rental apartments.
Then that seems like a situation where they're renting out the units. If there are property maintenance, or life safety issues, please let our office know so we can do an inspection.
I'm not climbing those stairs again.
Alderman Schennemeyer, sorry.
This is just a slight piggybacking of what Dr. Nash said that I really like. It's before we enacted our zoning code and our city was growing organically, our zoning code is a very recent thing, and as is a lot of the zoning codes used in the United States and Canada, because it flies in the face of how humans built cities since humans built cities. So these strict rules of only 1 lot per area is a radical experiment that the US and Canada primarily have been doing for how to build places for people and build them around primarily automobiles, which has been to a lot of our detriment overall. So it's just another word use that our planning and zoning director used that I think really points out how we do things could be changed.
I would argue that Ward 8 and Ward 1 and parts of Ward 2 and 3 are not in that
Yes.
category. They were built way before the post-World War II housing boom.
Madam Chair.
Okay, Alderman Gay and then
Oh.
Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say, if it's a handful of people, I would support this amendment. Obviously, it doesn't mean anything right now until it comes to the council, but, just making that known. And secondly, I was on the council in 1970, and I can tell you we did not intend for it to create all of these issues now. I'm telling you that.
I don't know what he said.
Were you not only on the council?
You
You were
weren't.
not even a glimmer of your parents. I mean, really?
Right. It's funny thing when you guys were saying that, I'm like, damn, my mom wasn't even born until 75.
Oh my God, I feel old.
Okay, so I'm sorry, Alderwoman Tierney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is a slippery slope in the fact that we do not know how many of these are out there. We know from testimony, et cetera, but that was the objective of my amendment, to give them this amnesty period, because I would have to question, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? They want to be grandfathered for doing what? So they should volunteer that, and they should be inspected, and I'm sure, their license won't be in jeopardy or something, but they may not be, as Dr. Nash said, they may not be an accessory dwelling unit. So they still have their short-term rental. But again, that is what my amnesty amendment, objective of the amnesty amendment was. I think this is definitely a slippery slope, because we do not know what's out there. It could be 5, it could be 50. Thanks.
Thank you. Alderman Schnellmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is something that can calm the fears of a couple people. Now, again, I haven't been inside their units. I don't know if they match our codes with stoves or whatever that weird gray area is. It would just kind of cover them if what they got right now is safe. It would just let them keep what they have right now, even if they have a stove that's plugged in and did that somehow legally to keep their current in compliance short-term rental license. So this wouldn't add to the stock of STRs. This would just let some folks keep what they have, and it's a pretty small number of people who've kind of stepped forward and talked to me about this. Checking for compliance with your amendment. Amendment, was it 7?
Correct.
7 is a good idea. It may help clarify a couple things for some people, and they might go, oh, it turns out I don't have an ADU and I can keep using it as an STR because it's one of those things,
Yeah.
which cool. But, some people might, and we let it slide for whatever reason, and it's now a kind of an essential part of their income. So this would, again, not add to the stock, just let some people keep what they got.
That's not my concern about adding to the stock. I don't think, legislation for 2 or 3 or 4 people isn't good practice. And it is, again, my objective in my amendment to see what's out there and get them licensed and inspected regardless of what category they fall under.
Okay, thank you. Committee members, are we ready to?
Well, can we have a recap of what we did? I'm trying to figure out. The committee,
Well,
the committee, I
first of all,
think.
Corey, I'll go through them.
Oh,
But 11 is what we were still discussing.
I thought it was going back
and-
to law. I thought it was going back to law, so.
Yeah, well, that's what I was getting ready to say. So you're going to take this back to law and bring it back on the floor for the full body.
Yeah,
Okay.
Ashley's gonna help me out, so we'll be
So
good.
I'll go through what I have. Ms. Green, help me out if I misspeak. On Amendment 1, we gave a favorable recommendation,
By 2 to 1?
2 to 1. Amendment 2, we opposed. And I don't have a count for these.
By 2 to 1.
2 to 1
2
again.
to 1.
Amendment 3, we opposed.
2 to 1.
2 to 1. Amendment 4 was withdrawn. Amendment 5, we gave a favorable recommendation.
Unanimous.
Is that 2-1 or 3-1?
Unanimous.
Oh, unanimous, 3-.
3-0.
Oh, okay, number 6, we gave a favorable recommendation.
Unanimous. Unanimous.
Unanimous. Amendment 7, favorable. Unanimous.
Yes.
Number 8 was withdrawn. Number 9 was withdrawn. And number 10 was support. Was that unanimous also?
Unanimous.
And that's it.
Okay,
All right.
so now do we have to have a,
So we can take a vote on 0921 as amended by this committee. By amended favorably by this committee, which means with 5, 6, 7, and 10. No, I'm sorry, 1, 5, 6, 7, and 10. Could I get a motion?
I'm so moved.
second?
Second, okay. Further discussion? No. All all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, so that would be unanimous. All right. Thank you to everyone, committee members, and my colleagues who joined us. Brooks, you had a long day and then you came straight here, so thank you. And we'll continue this discussion with Amendment 11 on the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Could I make a motion to adjourn?
Can I get a second? All in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. And sir, we never called on you or gave you an opportunity. I know you yelled out one time and I shut you right